Are you a conservative? I think I am, but our views may differ completely. Conservatism is a word that's been worked to death. We've got social conservatives, fiscal conservatives, all kinds of conservatives. But what makes this topic so interesting to me is there are people out there who call themselves conservatives who are for all the things this government is doing. And the more I look at this, the more I study this, the present administration, and I'm talking about the federal government in Washington, D.C., they call themselves conservatives, they call themselves compassionate conservatives. They say they're really kind of advised and informed by the neoconservatives. We'll talk about all of those things. But if you look at what conservatism used to mean, and I submit to you what it ought to mean, they're not conservatives at all. If you think you're a conservative because you're against gay marriage and for the Iraq War, I want you to know there's another side to that story. And if you look at conservatism historically, you may not be a conservative. You can call yourself whatever you want. It's a free country. But it's useful to look back and look at the origins. One thing about conservatism, I want to talk about the principles of conservatism. What does it really mean? Or is it just a set of temporary, short-term policies and views that we're all lumping under that word? But what conservatism really is about, and this goes all the way back to English politicians a couple of hundred years ago, is a decent respect for the past. The government gets its rights, not because of the divine right of kings like they did in Europe, only the powers we give it. And if we haven't given it to them, then those powers reside in the states. And just because we say, there was a big flap some years ago when the right of privacy came out in some of these constitutional cases. And people would say, well, there's nothing in the Constitution about a right of privacy. Well, there isn't, but there's nothing in the Constitution that allows the government to invade your privacy. And that's the way to look at it. The way to look at it is not how do I get a right to resist the government, is where does the government get a right to come into my bedroom, to come into my house, and do any of those things. We've come a long way from that. And then Amendment 10 says, the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution or prohibited to it by the states are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. So if you look back at conservatism historically, there's a reverence for these amendments in the Constitution and the whole idea of limited government, which comes from our Constitution. Well, where does conservatism come from? In the United States, a self-conscious conservatism really starts back in the 50s, and one of the big movers in this was Bill Buckley, who wrote God and Man at Yale. And then Barry Goldwater. And Barry Goldwater is fascinating in some of these discussions when you compare Barry Goldwater, who ran for president in the 1964 election, with our current administration. Barry Goldwater is the father of conservatism. He wrote Conscience of a Conservative. And Barry Goldwater was all about leave me alone and conservative principles like fiscal responsibility. The government shouldn't be taking all your money and spending all your money. You ought to be able to do the things yourself. Now, lip service is still paid to that, but when we get to look at certain things like what the government is doing, promoting marriage and promoting chastity and all these things with your money, Barry Goldwater would be spinning in his grave. The national government has formed an allegiance with religion, particularly the religious right, and those folks are now lined up with big government. It's really kind of wacky. Here's the point I'm going to try to make all through this show, if I get the time, and that is this. Just because you think something's a good idea, and I'm married to a woman, I think marriage ought to be between a man and a woman, that's okay, but I don't think the national government ought to be defining marriage. I don't think that's their business. And so I agree completely with you that this government is not a conservative government, though they call themselves conservatives, and the failures of this government is going to result in a government, this is ironic, but it's already happened. The failures of the Bush administration, the incompetence, the Iraq War and all of that, has given us Republicans now out of power in the House and the Senate, and may wind up giving us Democrats in charge of everything come the next presidential election, which is ironic. I mean, I think these folks aren't conservative enough, and that's why they're messing up. And because they're not conservative enough, we get Nancy Pelosi and Harry Reid and perhaps a Democratic president, and they're not going to be for small government. They're not going to be for tax breaks and so forth, and that's where we are. You can be for freedom of religion. That's enshrined in our Constitution, and I don't think anybody's going to be against it, and I am all for it. But it's a little askew to say, well, I'm a conservative, I'm for the Constitution, I believe in religious freedom, but my religion's a little better than yours, so we ought to go first. I just think that's wrong. I mean, I think this country's founded on the idea, and we got a lot of people, good people coming to this country because every religion gets treated equally. That's what's going to cause some problems later in the discussion when you want to start giving out government money to religions. You want to give it to the Wiccans and the Scientologists and the Rastafarians and whoever else you can think of. So if you think because you're for prayer in schools you're a conservative, I think I'm going to disagree with you. Gail, I think you've been with us the longest. Go ahead, Gail. You want to talk about prayer in school? Which side of it are you on?
Hey, Bill, this is cool.
Oh, hi. How are you?
I agree with prayer in school, but I think it should be like a silent moment. Anybody wants to do it, fine. Anybody doesn't.
Yeah.
So you can split hairs, and then everybody's pleased, maybe.
That's hard to disagree with. I just think that once you start involving a public institution in prayer, then you wind up stepping on somebody's toes. And these people who want prayer in school, I don't think are really going to want certain prayers. They're not going to want Druid prayers. They're not going to want Hindu prayers. They're not going to want people talking about reincarnation. And that's the problem with it. You can't simultaneously value the Constitution, which treats all religions equally, and say, well, we're founded on Christian principles, so let's have Christian prayers, and if you don't like it, you can go somewhere else. Thanks for the call, Gail.
Okay, be good.
Okay.
Thanks.
What business is it of the federal government to set marriage policy at all? What are they doing about that? I mean, what? We have had our public officials, I actually heard President Bush saying marriage is sacred. That's a very legitimate belief, and most of you would probably agree with that. Bill Frist, who was the head of the Senate at the time, said marriage is a sacrament. And in the Catholic Church, I know marriage is a sacrament. If it is sacred, that is a thing that deals with religious values in God. And if it is a sacrament, why do you have to go to some clerk to get married, to get permission to get married? And why do you need the federal government to define it? Why shouldn't marriage just be a contract between two people, whatever you want it to be? I tell you, that solves the problem of gay marriage.